The girl draws water from the well in the center of her cabin floor, while outside, the temperature drops to 42 degrees below zero, and the settlement freezes in the dark. The water comes up at 55 degrees, the same temperature it has been every single day since she finished digging, warm enough that steam rises from the bucket in the cold morning air. Her cabin has not dropped below 48 degrees in 3 weeks, despite burning half the wood her neighbors consume. And the men who called her well a foolish waste of summer labor are now watching their own water buckets freeze solid while hers flows freely from the earth. Before we continue with this story, let us know where you are watching from in the comments below. And if you find yourself moved by tales of frontier survival and young people proving doubters wrong, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story is even more remarkable than this one. The well sits in the northwest corner of the cabin, a stone-lined shaft 4 feet across, descending 18 feet into the earth, where groundwater flows year-round at a constant temperature that neither summer heat nor winter cold can touch. Elsa Lindquist built it alone over the course of 3 months, while every adult in the Montana Territory settlement told her she was making a mistake that would flood her cabin, collapse her floor, and leave her worse off than before. She was 14 years old and had been orphaned for 5 months when she drove the first shovel into the dirt. Her father died on a night in February when the temperature dropped faster than anyone expected, and the fire could not keep pace with the cold that seeped through the cabin walls. Henrik Lindquist had been a careful man, experienced after 18 winters in the northern mountains, knowledgeable about fire management and cold weather survival in ways that should have kept him alive for decades more. But the cold did not care about experience or knowledge or careful preparation. The cold simply waited for the moment when human vigilance faltered, when the fire burned lower than it should have, when the gap between life and death narrowed to nothing at all. Elsa woke to find her father frozen in his bed, his body rigid beneath the bearskins he had pulled over both of them sometime in the night, his last act, one of protection for the daughter he could no longer protect. She buried him on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had worked trap lines together, digging through 20 inches of frozen ground with a pickaxe and her own relentless determination. She marked the grave with a wooden cross and carved his name into the pine with his own knife. Henrik Lindquist, born 1802, died February 1847. A good man who deserved better than to freeze to death in his own cabin. The question of what to do next consumed her thoughts for days afterward. She could leave, travel east to Fort Union, where civilization offered the safety of numbers and the structure of society. She could seek shelter with neighboring settlers, trading labor for protection, becoming a domestic servant in someone else's household. She could give up the cabin, abandon the trap lines, accept that a 14-year-old girl could not survive alone in the mountains where grown men died despite doing everything right. These were the sensible options, the choices that adults would recommend, the paths that led toward security, even if they led away from independence. Elsa considered each one carefully with the methodical thinking her father had taught her, weighing risks and benefits, calculating probabilities of survival under different scenarios. And then she rejected them all. She was not leaving. She was not giving up. She was going to stay in this cabin and find a way to survive that did not depend on fire alone, that did not leave her vulnerable to the same fate that had taken her father. The cold had killed Henrik Lindquist, but it would not kill his daughter. She would find something better, something the experienced adults had overlooked, something that would change the fundamental equation of winter survival. The idea came to her 3 weeks after the burial, rising from memories she had almost forgotten. Her grandmother in Sweden had drawn water from a well inside her farmhouse, a convenience that seemed merely practical at the time, but now revealed deeper significance. That water had always been the same temperature, cool in summer and warm in winter, drawn from depths where the earth maintained constant conditions regardless of what the sky was doing. The well water never froze, never grew too warm. simply existed at the temperature the deep earth preferred, asking nothing in return for its constancy. Elsa found her father's mining manual on the shelf where he kept his few precious books, and turned to the sections on groundwater and underground temperature. The technical language was dense, written for educated engineers rather than common miners. But Henrik had taught her to read carefully and puzzle through difficult passages until meaning emerged. The manual explained what her grandmother's well had demonstrated through daily use. Groundwater at depths below 15 feet maintained temperatures between 50 and 57 degrees year-round in northern latitudes, regardless of surface conditions. The Earth itself acted as a massive thermal buffer, absorbing summer heat so slowly that it never reached the water table before winter came, releasing winter cold so gradually that spring arrived before the deep ground noticed. A well drilled to sufficient depth became a connection to this constant temperature reservoir, a pipe reaching down into warmth that asked for nothing and provided everything. The implication struck her with the force of revelation. Her father had died because the cabin could not hold heat against the relentless cold outside. Fire fought that battle and lost, requiring constant feeding to maintain even marginal warmth, consuming wood faster than it could be gathered, demanding attention that exhaustion eventually denied. But what if the cabin had another source of warmth, one that required no fuel and no attention? Groundwater at 55 degrees was not hot, certainly not comfortable for bathing, but it was warm compared to air at 40 below zero. If she could bring that water into the cabin, keep it flowing or at least accessible, the thermal mass of the Earth itself would help fight the cold. The well shaft would become a conduit for warmth rising from below, a constant, gentle heat source that supplemented the fire rather than replacing it. Together, fire and well might succeed where fire alone had failed. The idea seemed almost too simple, which made her suspicious of it. If indoor wells provided such obvious benefits, why did no one in the settlement have them? She spent 2 weeks visiting neighboring homesteads, asking questions about water sources and well construction, trying to understand why this apparent solution had not already been implemented. The answers revealed the gap between knowledge and application that often separated innovation from convention. Most settlers drew water from creeks or outdoor wells, accepting the inconvenience of winter trips through snow and cold as simply the way things were done. Those who had considered indoor wells worried about flooding, about structural damage, about the difficulty of digging through a cabin floor without undermining the walls. The concerns were legitimate but not insurmountable, problems to be solved rather than barriers that could not be crossed. Magnus Eriksson, the nearest neighbor, dismissed the idea entirely when Elsa mentioned it during a visit. An indoor well would flood her cabin the first time the water table rose in spring, he said. The shaft would weaken her floor until it collapsed. The moisture would rot the logs from inside out. And even if none of those disasters occurred, the effort of digging 18 feet down through rock and clay would exhaust her before she reached water. She was a girl, he reminded her, not a miner. She should focus on practical survival rather than elaborate schemes that would only hasten her death. Lars Bergman offered similar advice when Elsa asked about his root cellar construction, curious whether the same techniques might apply to well digging. The Earth was not something to be trifled with, he told her. Men with years of experience had died in collapsed tunnels and flooded excavations. A 14-year-old girl had no business attempting work that would challenge a grown man with proper tools and training. Elsa listened to their warnings, with the careful attention her father had taught her to give any information, then set them aside as obstacles to be managed rather than reasons to abandon her plan. The settlers meant well, she understood. They were trying to protect her from dangers they considered obvious and insurmountable. But they were also trapped in conventional thinking, unable to imagine solutions they had never seen implemented, unwilling to believe that a child might perceive what adults had overlooked. Her father had taught her that experience was valuable but not infallible, that sometimes fresh eyes saw opportunities that familiar ones had learned to ignore. The settlers had survived many winters without indoor wells, which proved such wells were not necessary. But her father had also survived many winters, right up until the moment he had not. Survival was not proven by past success but by future continuation, and the future required solutions that went beyond what had always been done before. Elsa began planning her well in earnest, sketching designs by candlelight while spring slowly thawed the frozen ground. The design she developed over those weeks of planning addressed each concern the settlers had raised. Flooding could be prevented by building the well shaft high enough above the water table that seasonal fluctuations would not overflow the rim. Structural damage could be avoided by positioning the well away from load-bearing walls and reinforcing the surrounding floor with additional supports. Moisture could be managed through proper ventilation and a well cover that sealed the shaft when not in use. The digging itself would be brutal, she acknowledged, but it was not impossible. Her father's manual described techniques for single-person excavation that miners had used for centuries. She would dig slowly, carefully, shoring the walls as she descended, and eventually she would reach water. The location she chose was in the northwest corner of the cabin, as far as possible from the fireplace to avoid any interference with the chimney foundation, and away from the door to preserve easy movement through the living space. She marked a circle 3 feet in diameter on the packed dirt floor, smaller than ideal, but large enough to work in while descending, and to lower a bucket on a rope once complete. The morning she began digging, the 1st of June 1847, the ground had finally thawed enough to accept a shovel blade without requiring a pickaxe for every inch of progress. The first 3 feet came easily, the soil loose from the cabin's original construction, disturbed earth that yielded to her shovel with minimal resistance. She filled bucket after bucket, hauling each one outside to dump on a growing pile behind the cabin, her arms and shoulders learning the rhythm of dig, fill, lift, carry, dump, return. By the end of the first day, she had created a hole deep enough to stand in with her head below floor level, a beginning that felt like genuine progress despite the 17 feet that remained. The second day introduced her to the clay layer that would dominate the next 2 weeks of excavation. Dense, sticky, and stubborn, the clay resisted every tool she possessed. Her shovel blade slid off its surface without biting. Her pickaxe bounced back from strikes that should have broken it apart. She learned to work the clay in small sections, chipping away at edges, prying loose chunks that she wrestled into the bucket like living things that did not want to be moved. The work was exhausting in ways she had not anticipated, not just physically demanding, but mentally draining, requiring constant problem-solving as each foot of depth presented new challenges. At 6 feet down, she hit her first significant rock, a boulder the size of a pig embedded in the clay at an angle that made it impossible to work around. She spent 3 days on that single obstacle, digging around its edges to expose its full dimensions, then using an iron bar to lever it loose from the matrix that held it. The boulder weighed more than she did, and getting it out of the hole required a rope harness and a wooden tripod she constructed from pine poles to provide mechanical advantage. When the rock finally emerged from the shaft and rolled onto the cabin floor, Elsa sat beside it for an hour, too exhausted to move, contemplating the 12 feet of depth that still separated her from water. The settlers checked on her periodically during June and July, drawn by curiosity about her progress and, she suspected, anticipation of her failure. Magnus Eriksson visited twice, peering down into the deepening shaft with an expression that mixed grudging respect with continued skepticism. She had dug farther than he expected, he admitted. But she was not even halfway to the water table, and the real difficulties lay ahead. When she hit bedrock, or when the walls collapsed, or when she simply ran out of strength, He would be there to help her fill in the hole and accept that some ideas were better left untried. Ingrid Bergman brought food one afternoon, perhaps feeling guilty about the community's failure to help the orphaned girl, and stayed to watch Elsa work for an hour. The older woman said nothing critical, asked no pointed questions, simply observed the methodical way Elsa attacked the clay and rock at the bottom of her shaft. When she left, she told Elsa that Henrik would have been proud of her determination, if not necessarily her judgment. It was the closest thing to encouragement Elsa had received since announcing her plan, and she held on to it through the difficult weeks that followed, a small flame of validation in the cold wind of constant doubt that blew from every direction, except the deepening hole in her floor where warmth would eventually rise. By mid-July, she had reached 10 feet, well past the depth Magnus had predicted would defeat her, and the character of the work had changed completely. The shaft was now deep enough that she could no longer toss dirt out with her shovel. Every bucket had to be hauled up on a rope, a process that added minutes to each cycle and turned what had been difficult labor into something approaching torment. She developed a system that minimized wasted motion. Fill the bucket at the bottom, climb the ladder she had built from oak rungs and pine rails, haul the rope hand over hand until the bucket cleared the rim, dump it into a larger container, lower the empty bucket, descend the ladder, repeat. Each cycle took roughly 4 minutes. Each foot of depth required approximately 30 cycles. The mathematics of exhaustion became her constant companion, numbers that translated directly into hours of labor and days of progress that she tracked in a small notebook. The stone lining began at 12 feet, where the soil became wet enough to require reinforcement against collapse. She had gathered flat stones throughout the summer, hauling them from a creek bed 2 miles distant, on a travois she built from her father's old trapline sled. The stones were not perfectly shaped, requiring careful selection and occasional modification with a hammer to achieve reasonable fit. But they stacked well enough to form a stable wall when set in clay mortar. She laid the first course at the bottom of her current depth, then continued digging below it, removing soil from beneath the stone ring and allowing it to settle downward as she deepened the shaft. This technique, described in her father's mining manual as the sinking method, allowed her to build the stone wall from the top down rather than the bottom up. Each new course added above the last as the entire structure descended into the earth. The work was dangerous in ways that surface excavation was not. A collapse at 12 feet would bury her with no chance of escape. A single misstep on the wet ladder rungs could send her tumbling to a landing that might break bones or worse. She worked slowly and carefully, checking the stability of her stone walls constantly, never taking risks that haste might encourage. At 15 feet, she hit water for the first time, a seep at first, then a steady trickle that pooled at the bottom of the shaft faster than the soil could absorb it. The water was cold against her boots when she stood in it, perhaps 54 degrees according to the sensation on her skin. Exactly the temperature range her father's manual had predicted for this depth and latitude. She was close now, close enough that the end of digging was visible if not yet reached. The final 3 feet were the hardest of the entire project, standing ankle-deep in water that constantly replenished itself, working mud that behaved more like thick soup than solid earth. Elsa questioned her judgment for the first time since beginning. The water made everything slippery and uncertain. Her tools slid from her grasp. Her footing shifted with every movement. The mud she excavated had to be scooped rather than dug, filling her bucket with material that weighed half again what dry soil would have weighed. She worked in sessions of 30 minutes, then climbed out to warm herself by the cabin fire before descending again. The August days were warm enough that hypothermia was not a serious risk, but the constant immersion in cold water drained her energy and left her shivering even in sunlight. On the 23rd of August, at a depth of 18 feet and 4 inches, Elsa struck gravel and felt the water level begin to rise around her legs. She had reached the aquifer, the underground river of water that flowed through sand and stone beneath the surface soil, fed by mountain snowmelt and summer rains, maintained at constant temperature by the thermal mass of the earth itself. The water rose to her knees before stabilizing, then slowly began to clear as the mud she had disturbed settled out. By evening, the pool at the bottom of her shaft was 2 feet deep and clean enough to drink, water that would remain at 55 degrees whether the surface temperature was 90 above or 40 below. She climbed out of the shaft and sat on the cabin floor beside the well she had spent 3 months building, too exhausted to feel triumph, but aware that something significant had been accomplished. The hard part was over. The impossible thing that everyone said could not be done had been done by a 14-year-old girl working alone with hand tools and determination. September was devoted to finishing the well structure and preparing the cabin for winter. She extended the stone lining up to floor level, creating a circular wall that rose 6 inches above the surrounding surface to prevent accidental flooding from spills or splashes. She built a wooden cover for the shaft, a heavy oak lid that sealed tightly against a rim of pine planks, keeping the well closed when not in use while still allowing the warmth of the water below to radiate into the cabin. The cover could be lifted with a rope handle and propped against the cabin wall for easy access to the bucket and windlass she installed for drawing water. The windlass was a simple mechanism, a wooden drum mounted on an iron axle with a crank handle on one end, allowing her to lower and raise the water bucket with mechanical advantage rather than pulling rope hand over hand. She tested the system repeatedly, adjusting the rope length until the bucket descended exactly to water level, then rose high enough to clear the rim for pouring. The completed well worked precisely as she had designed it. The first real test came on an October night when the temperature dropped unexpectedly to 15 degrees, cold enough that ice formed on the water bucket she had left outside the cabin door. Elsa woke to cold air in the cabin, the fire having burned low during the night, and immediately checked the well. The water at the bottom remained liquid and warm, 55 degrees exactly, completely unaffected by the surface cold. She drew a bucket and carried it to the center of the cabin, where the radiant warmth of the water created a small zone of comfort in the chill morning air. The effect was subtle but real, a source of heat that required no fuel and asked no attention. She built up the fire to warm the cabin properly, but the well water had already demonstrated its value. On a night when the fire failed completely, that 55-degree water might make the difference between survival and death. November brought serious cold and the opportunity to observe how the well affected the cabin's overall temperature. She developed a routine of drawing water every few hours, letting the warm bucket sit in the cabin while their heat radiated into the surrounding air, then dumping the cooled water into a collection barrel near the door. The circulation kept fresh warm water constantly flowing through the living space, a slow but steady transfer of heat from the aquifer below to the air above. She also left the well cover cracked open during the coldest nights, allowing warm air from the shaft to rise directly into the cabin. The temperature at floor level near the well stayed noticeably warmer than the rest of the cabin, creating a gradient of comfort that she learned to exploit by positioning her bed nearby. The combined effect on firewood consumption was dramatic. Her neighbors were burning wood at alarming rates, their cabins demanding constant fuel to maintain marginal warmth against the relentless cold. Elsa burned perhaps half as much, her fire supplemented by the constant low-grade heat that rose from 18 feet below. The difference meant more than comfort. It meant her woodpile would last longer, her trips to gather fuel would be fewer, her exposure to dangerous cold during forest work would be reduced. The well was not just a water source. It was a survival system that integrated with everything else she did to stay alive. Magnus Eriksson visited in late November, ostensibly to check on her welfare, but obviously curious about the well he had predicted would fail. He stood at the rim and peered down into the darkness, then drew a bucket of water and tested it with his hand. The warmth surprised him visibly, though he tried to hide his reaction behind a mask of experienced indifference. It was a clever trick, he admitted. The water would keep her cabin slightly warmer and save some firewood. But it would not matter when true winter arrived, when temperatures dropped to 30 or 40 below and stayed there for weeks. No well could overcome that kind of cold. Elsa did not argue with him. She had learned that arguments changed no minds among people who had already decided what was possible. The winter would prove her case or refute it, and nothing she said would affect that outcome. She thanked Magnus for his visit and returned to her preparations, stacking firewood, checking cabin seals, making ready for the test that everyone agreed was coming. The worst winter in 50 years was about to begin, and Elsa was ready to face it with an advantage that no one else in the settlement possessed or even believed could exist. December arrived with cold that seemed personal in its intensity, temperatures dropping steadily from the merely brutal to the genuinely lethal. By the 10th of the month, the thermometer outside Elsa's cabin read 32 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, cold enough to kill livestock that lacked adequate shelter, cold enough to test every structure and every person in the settlement. The creek that supplied most homesteads with water froze solid within the first week, 6 inches of ice covering pools that had never frozen in anyone's memory. Settlers who relied on outdoor wells found their buckets coming up coated with ice, then stuck fast in shafts that had frozen from the surface down. Water became precious, rationed, fought over in small disputes that revealed the stress everyone was feeling. Elsa's well remained liquid and warm, 55 degrees at the surface of the water, the shaft acting as a chimney for warmth rising from depths that winter could not reach. She drew water freely, drinking as much as she wanted, washing when she needed to, sharing with Sigrid, who lapped gratefully from the bucket. The warmth she had counted on materialized exactly as she had hoped. Her cabin maintained temperatures between 45 and 50 degrees with moderate fire, while neighboring cabins struggled to reach 40 despite burning fuel at rates that would exhaust their supplies before spring. The difference was subtle but cumulative, 15 degrees that translated into comfort instead of misery, survival instead of constant crisis. She slept soundly while others lay awake shivering, tending fires that demanded attention every few hours. She woke rested while others woke exhausted, their bodies fighting to maintain core temperature rather than recovering from the previous day's labor. The well had given her an advantage that compounded with each passing day, a head start in the race against winter that grew larger as the cold wore down everyone else. Christmas came with temperatures that defied description, 45 degrees below zero on a night so still that smoke rose straight up from chimneys and hung in the air like columns supporting an invisible roof. Elsa spent the evening beside her fire, comfortable enough to read by candlelight, while the settlement around her endured what many would later describe as the worst night of their lives. She drew warm water from her well and heated it further over the fire, making tea that seemed impossibly luxurious given the circumstances. The cabin never dropped below 42 degrees despite the hellish cold outside, the well contributing its constant warmth, the fire doing less work than it would have done alone. She thought about her father that night, wondering if he would have believed in her well if she had proposed it while he was alive, wondering if the idea would have occurred to her if his death had not forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about survival. The answer did not matter, but the question occupied her mind through the long dark hours until dawn finally arrived. January brought the storms that had been predicted since autumn, massive systems sweeping down from Canada, with winds that created drifts 20 feet high against any obstacle in their path. The first blizzard lasted 4 days, visibility dropping to nothing, the cabin shaking with gusts that seemed strong enough to tear the roof away. Elsa retreated into routine, tending fire, drawing water, eating from supplies she had stockpiled, waiting for the weather to exhaust itself. The well remained her constant comfort during those days of isolation. Warm water for drinking, warm water for cooking, warm water to heat in pots and set around the cabin as additional radiators against the cold. The moisture from evaporation kept the air from becoming too dry, protecting her skin and lungs from the cracking dryness that plagued cabins where fire burned constantly without any humidity source. When the storm finally broke on the 5th day, Elsa emerged to find a transformed landscape of smooth white drifts and buried structures. Smoke rose from some chimneys, evidence of life continuing beneath the snow, but other cabins showed no sign of activity. She would learn later that 2 families had let their fires die during the worst of the blizzard, the constant demands of fuel gathering having exhausted them beyond the ability to continue. They survived only by burning furniture and floorboards, desperate measures that saved their lives while destroying their homes. Elsa's fire had never wavered. Her woodpile had never run low. Her well had continued to supplement her heating without asking anything in return. The impossible advantage that everyone had dismissed was proving itself week after week, and the worst of winter was yet to come. The real crisis came in the 2nd week of February, 1 year almost to the day after her father's death. A storm arrived that made January's blizzard seem gentle by comparison, a week of continuous wind and snow and cold that tested the limits of human endurance. The temperature dropped to 52 degrees below zero on the 3rd night, cold so extreme that the air itself seemed to have weight, pressing down on everything with the patience of deep time. Trees exploded in the forest as frozen sap expanded beyond what their trunks could contain. Animals that had survived every previous winter were found frozen in their burrows. And in the cabins of the settlement, fires that had burned continuously for months began to fail. The problem was not fuel, though supplies were running low in many households. The problem was that the cold had become too intense for fire to fight alone. Heat fled through walls and roofs faster than flames could generate it, the battle finally tipping in favor of an enemy that had been winning slowly all winter. Cabin temperatures dropped despite continuous burning, 35 degrees, then 30, then 25, approaching the point where human bodies could not maintain themselves even wrapped in every blanket available. Elsa noticed the crisis when she stepped outside on the 4th morning and saw Magnus Eriksson's cabin showing no smoke from its chimney. The sight alarmed her enough to wade through chest-deep snow for the quarter-mile journey to his homestead, arriving to find the door drifted shut and the windows dark. She pounded on the planks until Magnus responded from inside, his voice weak and confused, the words of a man whose body temperature had dropped into the dangerous range. His fire had died during the night, he told her through the door. He could not get it restarted. His hands were too numb to work the flint and steel. He thought he might just rest for a while, let the cold take him, stop fighting what could not be defeated. Elsa broke through the drift, blocking his door, and found him lying on his bed, covered with everything he owned, shivering in a cabin that could not have been more than 20 degrees inside. She worked quickly, building a fire from materials she found near the hearth, coaxing flames from tinder that wanted to be ice. Within an hour, the cabin had warmed enough that Magnus could move again, his confusion clearing as his body temperature rose. He looked at Elsa with the expression of a man who had been prepared to die and found himself unexpectedly still alive. She brought him to her cabin because his own was no longer safe. The woodpile exhausted, the structure too compromised by the storm to maintain any heat, even with fire burning. He protested weakly, embarrassed to accept help from the girl he had mocked, but his body overruled his pride. He needed warmth, and Elsa's cabin was the only place in the settlement that had warmth to spare. The well amazed him in ways that the previous visit had not. With the fire burning normally and the well cover propped open, her cabin maintained 50 degrees, while the worst cold in memory pressed against the walls. 50 degrees was not comfortable by any normal standard, but it was survival temperature, safety temperature. The difference between life and death when the alternative was 20 degrees in a cabin without supplemental heat. Magnus sat beside the well and felt the warmth rising from 18 feet below, understanding finally what Elsa had built and why it mattered. Over the next 3 days, others came. The Nilsson family arrived first, their cabin having developed cracks in the chinking that let the cold pour through like water. Then the Holmbergs, whose infant could not survive the temperatures their struggling fire maintained. Then Tobias went, who had run out of firewood on the 5th day, and faced the choice between freezing and burning his furniture. Elsa took them all in, her small cabin filling with refugees from the cold, bodies packed together in a space that would have been miserably crowded under normal circumstances, but felt like salvation now. The well served them all, providing water that did not need to be melted from snow, contributing warmth that supplemented the fire, creating conditions that made survival possible for 9 people in a cabin built for 2. They slept in shifts, ate from Elsa's stockpile of preserved food, and waited for the storm to end. The same people who had laughed at her well now depended on it for their survival, a reversal that Elsa noted without comment or satisfaction. There would be time for vindication later. For now, survival was all that mattered to any of them. The storm broke on the 8th day, the wind dying gradually through the night until dawn arrived with clear skies and temperatures that had moderated to merely brutal. The refugees emerged from Elsa's cabin into a landscape that looked like nothing any of them had seen before. Snow drifted higher than rooftops in some places, cabins buried to their chimneys, trees snapped like twigs across hillsides that had been forested for centuries. The settlement had been transformed into something barely recognizable, a collection of snow mounds with smoke trickling from a few that still maintained functioning fires. Of the 12 families who had lived in the valley before the storm, 2 had lost members to the cold. The Anderson family, who lived farthest from any neighbors, had been found frozen in their cabin when searchers finally reached them, the fire having died days before the storm ended. Old Mrs. Lindberg had collapsed while trying to gather firewood during a brief lull and had been buried by drifts before anyone could find her. The losses were devastating in a community so small that everyone knew everyone, but they could have been much worse. 9 people had survived in Elsa's cabin who would almost certainly have died in their own homes. The well that everyone had mocked had made that survival possible. The days following the storm were devoted to recovery and repair, digging out buried structures, assessing damage, sharing resources among families whose supplies had been exhausted. Elsa found herself at the center of these efforts despite her youth, the proven success of her well having established a credibility that her age alone could never have earned. Settlers who had dismissed her ideas now asked her advice on construction and survival strategies. Men who had laughed at her planning now listened carefully when she spoke about thermal mass and groundwater temperature. The mockery had stopped completely, replaced by a respect that bordered on reverence among those who had spent a week in her cabin understanding exactly what she had built and why it worked. Magnus Eriksson was the first to ask for her help building a well of his own. He approached her awkwardly, embarrassed by the memory of his predictions of failure, unsure how to request assistance from someone he had condescended to for so long. Elsa agreed without hesitation or any mention of his previous skepticism. The well had proven its value, and the proof was sufficient. Dwelling on who had been right and who had been wrong served no purpose except to satisfy pride, and pride was a luxury that frontier survival did not permit. They began digging Magnus's well in April, as soon as the ground thawed enough to accept a shovel, working together on a project that would have taken Elsa 3 months alone, but required only 6 weeks with 2 people sharing the labor. The well reached water at 16 feet, slightly shallower than her own, and produced the same constant temperature supply that had kept her cabin warm through the worst winter in memory. By the end of May, 2 other families had begun excavations of their own, following designs that Elsa provided and techniques she had developed through her own experience. The settlement was transforming, adopting an innovation that had seemed impossible a year before, building infrastructure that would protect against winters yet to come. Summer brought visitors from other settlements who had heard about the well that saved 9 lives during the February storm. Trappers and traders carried the story east to Fort Union and west to the scattered mining camps of the mountains, each telling adding details that made the tale more remarkable. A 14-year-old girl had dug a well inside her cabin. The well never froze and provided warmth without fuel. The entire settlement had survived a storm that killed people across the territory by sheltering in her home. The story spread faster than any message could travel deliberately, passed from person to person around campfires and in trading posts, becoming legend before anyone thought to write it down. Elsa received the visitors with patience, answering their questions, showing them the well, explaining the principles that made it work. She understood that each visitor who learned and carried the knowledge home was a potential life saved somewhere else, a multiplication of benefit that extended far beyond her small cabin in the Montana mountains. The well was not just her survival anymore. It was becoming something larger, an idea spreading through frontier communities, changing how people thought about winter and warmth and the relationship between human structures and the earth below them. The girl who had lost her father to the cold was teaching others how to never lose anyone that way again. The years that followed the Great Storm saw Elsa's innovation spread throughout the Montana Territory and beyond. By 1855, indoor wells had become standard construction practice in frontier settlements from the Dakotas to Oregon, a technology so obviously beneficial once demonstrated that people wondered why no one had thought of it before. The answer, Elsa understood, was that everyone had thought of it at some level. The knowledge that groundwater maintained constant temperature was not new. The practice of indoor wells existed in European farmhouses for centuries. What had been missing was the application, the willingness to combine known principles into a solution that challenged conventional frontier building practice. The settlers who mocked her well had possessed the same knowledge she possessed. They simply had not seen what she saw because they were not desperate enough to look. Desperation had been her advantage, the death of her father freeing her from assumptions that experience had calcified into certainty. She had looked at the cabin that killed Elsa Lindquist and asked what could be different, what could be added, what could make the difference between freezing and surviving. The question had led to the answer that changed everything. Elsa married in 1852, a surveyor named James Garrett, who had traveled west to map routes for the railroad companies that were already planning their eventual expansion across the continent. James had heard stories about the well that saved a settlement before he ever met the woman who built it, and he had detoured 50 miles from his assigned route specifically to see the innovation for himself. What he found was a 14-year-old legend who had grown into a 19-year-old woman of remarkable capability and deeper beauty, someone who had survived what should have killed her and emerged stronger than anyone had right to expect. Their courtship was brief by the standards of the time, conducted over 3 weeks of conversation, while James extended his survey work to include every excuse for remaining in the settlement. They married in the same cabin where Elsa had built her well, the ceremony witnessed by Magnus Eriksson and the Bergman family, and everyone else who had once doubted and now believed. The well provided water for the celebration, 55 degrees and clear as crystal, drawn from depths that neither joy nor sorrow could ever reach. They built a new home together on land that James claimed under the Homestead Act, a proper house with a proper well dug before the walls went up, the design incorporating everything Elsa had learned from her first crude excavation. The new well was 4 feet in diameter and 22 feet deep, lined with dressed stone rather than rough field rock, equipped with a pump mechanism that James designed based on engineering principles he had learned in the East. The house maintained comfortable temperatures through every winter they spent there. the well supplementing wood heat so effectively that visitors sometimes asked why they kept such small fires burning. The answer was always the same. The earth provides what fire alone cannot. Trust the ground beneath you and you will never freeze. They had 6 children over 14 years, 4 daughters and 2 sons, each of whom learned to dig and maintain wells as naturally as they learned to read and farm and hunt. The knowledge passed from generation to generation, spreading through marriage and migration and simple conversation, until indoor wells became so common in northern territories that people forgot there had ever been a time when they were considered impossible. Elsa lived to see the railroad arrive in Montana, the iron horse that James had helped survey routes for finally crossing the mountains she had called home for more than 40 years. She lived to see her grandchildren grow and start families of their own, the Lindquist-Garrett line spreading across 3 territories by the time she reached her 7th decade. She lived long enough to tell the story of her first well to children who could not imagine a time when such things were unusual, when a girl digging a hole in her cabin floor was considered foolish rather than practical. The story grew with each telling, not through exaggeration, but through the accumulation of detail that only a participant could provide, the texture of memory that transformed simple facts into lived experience. She remembered the smell of the clay at 8 feet down. She remembered the cold shock of hitting water for the first time. She remembered Magnus Eriksson's face when he realized that everything he believed about wells and warmth and the capability of young girls had been wrong. Those memories sustained her through her final years, proof that she had lived a life that mattered, that she had changed something for the better. Elsa Lindquist Garrett died in the spring of 1904, 61 years after digging her first well, surrounded by children and grandchildren in a house that had never known a cold winter. She was 71 years old, her hair white but her eyes still sharp, her mind still clear with memories that stretched back to a time when the Montana Territory was wilderness, and a girl's survival depended on nothing but her own determination. The funeral drew mourners from across 3 states, some traveling for days to pay respects to a woman whose innovation had saved lives they would never know about, whose stubborn refusal to accept what everyone believed had created warmth that would outlast her by centuries. They buried her on a hillside overlooking the valley where she had built her first cabin, not far from the grave she had dug for her father 61 years before. The headstone James had commissioned read simply, Elsa Lindquist Garrett, 1833 to 1904. She kept us warm. The minister spoke about faith and perseverance and the mysteries of providence that allowed a young girl to see what experienced adults had missed. Magnus Eriksson had died years earlier, but his son spoke at the funeral, telling the story his father had told him countless times about the well that saved his life, the girl who had dragged him from his frozen cabin and given him shelter when he had been prepared to die. The Eriksson family well, dug with Elsa's help in the spring of 1848, still functioned perfectly, still provided water at 55 degrees year-round, still supplemented the heating of a cabin that had been expanded and improved, but never rebuilt from scratch. 3 generations of Erikssons had drawn water from that well. 3 generations more would follow before anyone thought to replace it with something newer. Her grandson Eric, the eldest child of her eldest daughter, delivered the eulogy with the steady voice of a man who had practiced what he would say until the words flowed without effort. She was 14 years old and alone, he began, his voice carrying across the gathered mourners to the hills beyond. Her father had just died. Everyone told her she was wrong. They laughed at her idea. They called it a waste of time. They said a girl could not dig a well by herself, could not understand what experienced men had never tried, could not survive alone in the mountains where stronger people had failed. She built it anyway. She built it with her own hands, bucket by bucket, stone by stone, through an entire summer, while grown men shook their heads and waited for her to fail. She reached water at 18 feet. She lined the shaft with stones she carried from a creek 2 miles away. She created something that had never existed in this territory before, something that would spread to every settlement within a decade, something that changed how people survived winter forever. And when the worst storm anyone had ever seen arrived, when the men who laughed were burning their furniture and watching their families freeze, they came to her door. They came begging to be let into the cabin with the well they had mocked. And she let them in. Every single one. My grandmother never spoke of vindication or revenge or proving anyone wrong. She spoke only of warmth, of the simple gift of not freezing, of the earth that held its temperature regardless of what the sky decided to do. She understood something that most people never grasp, that survival is not about being right but about being warm, not about winning arguments but about living through nights that could kill you. The well was never about showing anyone that she was smarter or better or more capable. It was about making sure that the cold that took her father would never take anyone else. Eric paused, looking out at the assembled mourners, at the families that existed, because his grandmother had refused to freeze. "The well still works," he continued. "The water still comes up at 55 degrees, 61 years after she dug it. Every well built on her design still works, across 3 territories, in settlements she never visited, for people she never met. That is her legacy. Not the story of a girl who proved doubters wrong, but the warmth that continues rising from the earth she learned to trust." The mourners filed past her grave as the spring sun warmed the hillside, each placing a small stone on the cairn that would mark her resting place. Somewhere below them, 18 feet down in the cabin she had built as a frightened orphan, water still flowed at 55 degrees, warm and constant and eternal, waiting for anyone who needed it, just as she had always intended it to be from the very beginning.